Alright, well welcome back to the second part of the tutorial here, where I finished drawing this hot rod in one of my books, in the Masters of Chicken Scratch Volume 2. As you can kind of see, I left this front area kind of in a framed area so that I could draw sketches in there, and it makes a nice little page, even for people to sign in and stuff. So anyways, just going through and handling some of the details. Starting to work on the engine a little bit. So kind of just to give a rundown, in the first part I laid out my really rough lines just to get a sense of proportion and how my car is going to lay out on the page, and making sure just little details like that the stance looks right, it looks aggressive, it looks cool. It's kind of a hard thing to define. You talk about making it look cool. Everybody wants to have a cool sketch. Well, how do you do that? And part of it is really learning about proportions, the right stance of a car. And obviously the different kind of cars, you're going to have different stances out there. You're going to have sedans, you're going to have sports cars, you're going to have trucks, commuter cars. So you got a variety of stuff, and each one of those cars really does have, what's called a stance, or a proportion to it. From a really aggressive sports car is going to have a very aggressive look, whereas, a sedan is going to be more of a multi-person car, so it doesn't have near the aggressive stance that a sports car does. And hot rods have a very unique stance to them, partly because they're open wheeled, and they tend to be lowered a little bit, kind of depending on the type of hot rod you're building. And so it's just good, and you learn all that stuff just by looking at a lot of reference photos, and even using reference photos when you're drawing stuff. Nothing wrong with that at all. Before I started this drawing, I went ahead and looked at several, different variations of hot rods, and just give myself some ideas in my head when I go to drawing it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just, drawing through all the stuff, making sure wheels line up and the grill's lined up, and suspension and stuff that's necessary to make the car look complete. I just keep going back and forth on this grill because I was not happy with it. I wanted it to give it, a handmade look, but still have a cool appearance and an aggressive look to the car. When I think about hot rods, I think about a very industrial type piece of machinery that's been, a lot of it's been hand built. It started out as an original car that came off an old assembly line, but throughout the years people have modified it and messed with it, and so you want to show some parts that are on there that look hand built, and give it a kind of a nostalgic look. So here I'm kicked out my wheel a little bit more. That wheel was just not looking good earlier, so changed it around a little bit. Now I'm just adding the other wheel to the other side. As you can see, I draw the guidelines from the center of the axle, and then also from the top and the bottom of the wheel to give me my other side, to give me my other wheel on the other side. And there I'm drawing in just a general idea of the suspension coming up and holding on to the wheel, and that helps me place the other wheel on there. So here's the ellipse templates. I have ellipse templates that range from 15 to 60 degrees, and then I have a bigger set that's in a big book that goes, I believe, from 10 to 80 degrees. So you have a little bit more variation. But I tend to use my small ones a lot just for the size of the sketch in these books. So what you do is you get your axle line in there, and there's these two little tick marks on each side of the ellipse, and you line those little tick marks up with the axle. And here I am, I'm just double checking to make sure that my perspective is accurate, making sure my axle line is correct. And I'm doing that partly because of the wheel on the other side. I can't tell exactly where the placement is on that. So I'm drawing more guidelines off the rest of the body of the car and kind of using that as my guidelines for the axle on the front wheel. So now with that, I used a bigger ellipse in the front, and you're going to use a thinner ellipse in the back. So I go with a 40 degree. And again, lining up the tick marks to the axle line on the hot rod. And then making my ellipse. Now with this, you'll notice that I'll draw an outer ring and then an inner ring, and what that represents is you have the upper lip to the tire, and then you have the lower lip to the tire, and then you have the rim in the center. And when I was at Art Center, I just learned to draw my wheels with a crisp edge. Obviously tires don't have that, but it gives a really good solid look to the wheel when you draw it on a car. It does give a little bit of a modern look too, so you gotta be a little bit careful about that if you're strictly going with a period correct, hot rod drawing, which I would consider more of a piece of art. What I'm doing here, I consider a little bit of art and design both, but I consider a little more on the design side. So it's using all line. And so I just use that same method. Now if I was doing a piece of art, I would probably go back and change those tires into something typically very traditional, so they'd be rounded instead of the crisp edge on the edge of the tire. You can see I'm messing around. I couldn't figure out. I was just still frustrated with that grill and that tire because of the placement on the page. And I know I've said this in the past, but when you're drawing vehicles and stuff, you kind of want to work the whole sketch, and you can bounce around to different areas on the sketch. I mean, there's definitely parts of it that I knew that were good and I knew I was going to leave. So I'm kind of going back and working on that stuff and just letting my mind rest for a little bit and not think about that grill. Because sometimes you just need to step away from stuff and come back to it to really get a fresher perspective on it and figure out what's the best way to execute that whatever you're struggling on. So I kind of move all over the whole sketch and work on areas that I know that are right and darkening them in. Who knew that saying darkening them in would be so difficult? It is kind of difficult to say that really quick, I guess, if you think about it. So here I am just moving on to the headers area of the engine and just kicking back an exhaust that kind of goes into the body. It has this, again, rough look to it, not real refined, and that's okay for hot rod stuff if you're going for more of a traditional style. And then this pencil I'm using right now too is still a fairly light pencil. for working all this stuff. Man, I'm having a hard time talking right now. Anyways, this pencil is a fairly light one, and I use it quite often to lay down my early sketch. And then later I go back with Verithin and crisp up all the lines. Now with this engine area, as I kind of go in, I'm not really looking at any reference for this at all as I'm doing this. But I do kind of know the general look of a Weber carb or a single barrel carb. And I'm just adding in more indication than I am actual detail. And that's just more of a preference. Like I said, I'm treating it more of a design sketch versus an actual piece of art. If I was doing an actual piece of art, I'd probably use a Weber carburetor reference photo to really get that accurate. So here I'm still not happy with that whole front section. I'm not happy the way it's laid out. I realized that my wheel was probably a little too large in the front there. So, and just going back and working on the perspective just to make sure it's right. And I ended up going with a little smaller ellipse this time instead of the larger one. Just to kind of give that big wheel in the back and small wheel in the front look to it. When you do that, that also gives a more aggressive appearance to the car when you have a bigger wheel in the back and a smaller wheel in the front. It's like a lot of race cars are like that. Muscle car proportions are like that. Even a lot of supercars proportions are like that. You get a bigger wheel in the back, smaller wheel in the front. Just adds to the aggressiveness. So yeah, I go with a smaller ellipse. And then I also get an ellipse that's a little more open, I believe. I wasn't happy with it was a little too squashed. So the other reason I used this type of pencil for my layout sketch originally is when you use regular lead, it erases better. Whereas if you're using a Verithin, it kind of sticks to the paper. It's a little more waxy, so you can't erase it as well. Just a tip to remember if you're laying out your initial sketches to use a regular pencil first. So here, since that was a pretty wide open ellipse, I believe that was a 60 degree on the front there. So now I'm using a 100%. So this is a 100% wide open circle now for the other side. So I go ahead and continue that wheel onto the next page just so I can see the proportion. And that finally feels good. I feel like I probably should have done that a long time ago. Was put that wheel on the other side, because now I can see the whole car overall. So now that I feel good about that whole front end and getting that other wheel in there, now I'm going to go through and start really darkening up a bunch of stuff. So this is kind of the fun part when you go in and start crisping up all your lines, making your line work read really nice. You really start to see the car as a whole, and it starts to look a little tighter now. And you start adding in little details, like I did little rivets across there on the overhang. So now that I feel good about my wheels, I'm going to go in here and start filling them in a little bit more, giving them a little more detail. So there I just was putting in some tick marks. So now I decide, no, maybe I'll add a little dimension to this front grille a little bit. Still keeping it fairly simple. But now I'm going to go in and start indicating, well, what I call indicating with my pencil, you know, all the engine details and stuff. You know, when you look at an engine, you'd see all these light and dark areas in the engine. You'd see pipes and reflections, so you get all these really crazy highlights and dark areas on the engine. So I take a little bit of an approach as an illustration approach and a little bit of design approach combined when I'm drawing a lot of these sketches. And what that means is, like, illustration looks at a lot of light and dark areas and negative and positive space, you know, even a little more of a fine art approach, whereas the designer actually looks at line. So you look at the line work, and I'm kind of combining the two practices when it comes to my engine stuff. So I'm just adding in light and dark areas and adding in indication, just to give a sense of some detail there on the engine, but not going overboard where I'm using photo reference and I'm drawing it exactly, you know, like it looks. I think that's what I always was attracted to about the design side of stuff, is that if you make it look like it functions, you know, people will gravitate towards it and make it, you know, they think it looks really cool then. And I know as a kid I used to think that. And as a designer, you know, you learn about this stuff and you can sit there and draw and indicate basically what's really going on an engine, but it's not exactly like it. And to me, when you add all those details, like in an engine, like if you were copying a photograph or something like that and you add that all on here as a design sketch, it becomes tedious and boring, and it can actually suck some life out of your sketch. Now, unless you're treating it as a piece of art and you're going in and rendering after a photo, that's a different story. That's a different type of artwork, because it's actually being done as a piece of art versus a design sketch. So you can see, just by adding dark areas and light areas in there, it already starts to look, there's some complication to the engine, which is what you want. You want it to look a little bit complicated so that you know that there's detail there. So here I'm just erasing the tip of the wheel off. And you do part of that just to make it look like it's stuck to the ground. You don't want to make it look like the tires are melted into the ground, but if you just erase just the top of the tire off at the bottom, it makes it look like it's resting on the tires versus floating, or not really floating, but sitting on top. So when you do that, it makes it look like the rubber is kind of pressed down into the road, you know, like a real tire would be on a car. And it also gives the appearance that it's sitting on something, it's sitting on a road. Or so here you can see me drawing straight down from the wheel, and what I'm drawing is just an indication of a shadow from the open wheels. with your shadows, you can always kind of cheat those a little bit to make the car look lower than it really is. I see that done a lot on concept sketches and all kinds of stuff. And that again makes the sketch look aggressive, or the car look a little more aggressive. So what I'm doing here on the pipe is I'm drawing straight down and figuring out where that shadow's coming off the header and the pipe. And I'm also just lighting this car with a directly overhead light so that I can put the shadow on the ground. You can do it. I've seen lots of guys draw the shadows differently, you know, depending on where the light's coming from. You can make them really, really cool and almost like a piece of art the way you lay down your shadow. But you have to keep that in mind too when you're drawing your lighting source. Just getting rid of some of my light line work there. Get rid of that piece so the pipe looks solid now instead of being ghosted. I believe in this sketch I never did pull out my Verithin. I just ended up doing the whole thing in pencil lead after I was just talking about Verithin. The thing I do like about the Verithin though is it gives it's darker. It's like a really solid black when you lay it down, and it also gives you good solid line work that lasts. Like pencil lead can actually smudge and smear and stuff like that, but when you lay down the Verithin, it'll make the sketch last a long time. But since this is in a book, you don't have to worry about it, you know, being thrown around in other drawings and in your portfolio or anything like that. So it'll be held really nice with the pencil lead even. So now I'm just doing a little bit of cross hatching, a little bit of the detail areas. Again, you know, with the suspension, just adding some dark and light areas like I did with the engine. Just to give some indication that something's holding onto that wheel. Still not too sure about this grill. I think I finally just, I go with some vertical slots in the grill. I keep it simple instead of trying to fight it anymore. So when you're drawing your darker lines, try to do one stroke. So what I'm kind of doing is drawing over the top of it at first, and then what they call ghosting, and then I'll come back and lay down my final kind of hard line. Now as I'm going through the sketch, I'm just adding a little bit of cross hatching for dark and light areas. This is the underside of the valve cover, so it's going to be darker than most of the rest of the engine. So this is where I start treating the sketch more like an illustration versus a line drawing for a design. Because most design sketches have some type of value to them, whether it's using a pencil or a marker, watercolor, doing it in Photoshop or Painter or something like that. It's always good to get some value in there. for a couple reasons. It makes the sketch read really, it makes it read better. And the second, it also gives volume to all your components that you've drawn out. It also gives the viewer a better understanding of how your car looks, where the surfaces turn and what are deep cutouts or, whatever that needs to be explained on your car. So right here I kind of did a little bit more of a modernistic detail with this line around the window. It's a little more hard edge than what you would get on a typical hot rod, which I think is okay. Combine a little bit of modernism with traditionalism. So right here I was kind of thinking of maybe a possible ragtop area, or maybe when it's at a show you can pop that panel up and see inside the interior. So the sketch is getting really close to being done. I'm just going through and darkening up, like I said, adding more value in certain areas. Definitely got to get the pipes in there, or the intake manifold area, because those are going to be a deep hole, so I add a pretty dark shadow on there. Again, going back, adding some indication to the engine. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and finish up these shadows here. And I kind of leave the shadow a little bit rough towards the front of it, towards the top of the shadow, because it would kind of fade away as it's pulling away from the object. The other thing is, when you're drawing your shadows, go ahead and draw your cross hatches the same direction as the perspective. It helps with the direction of the perspective, and it also just gives a more consistent look this way. Then another trick is to what I call vignetting, and you make it darker towards the front and fade out towards the back, so your shadow shouldn't be as dark as the front area. I shouldn't say shouldn't, that's just a stylistic thing that I personally use. I think it adds a lot more interest to the sketch when you kind of focus in on a certain area towards the front and let it fade out towards the back. Getting my bolts on there to hold on the wheels. Some lug nuts. Then once in a while you'll see me, like I just drew that curved line over the top of that hubcap to give myself a sense of how that surface is rounding, so that I can draw the kind of the core going across there to give some indication of what that wheel looks like. So I left these wheels really simplistic on this. Here I'm giving myself basically a break in the shadow. So the shadow's on there to indicate the wheel, that it's concaved, so it's deep dished a little bit. And I decided that it looked real messy the way I had drawn that wheel shadow. I was trying to follow the wheel, and it didn't look good at all, so I went back and just did them all in the same direction. I was talking about keeping your hash marks uniform on the shadow, and then I go and do something different, and I didn't like it at all, so I went back and changed it. So here you go. You have the firewall there, and that's going to get some. That's going to be a darker area. Partly because it's pressed up against the engine, and it's also just it's turned straight down from the car, so you're not going to get a lot of light on it. I'm also just adding a little bit of detail to the firewall here, just to give it some dimension. You can see me drawing that little line. That's basically my center line that I just drew in there. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that area in, kind of darken up certain areas on the engine there. So what I drew here is instead of just drawing it straight down all with the hash marks, I gave some dimension to the wall just to give some interest and not keep it so straight down and boring. And then adding in some, possible rivet details or something like that in there. Then going in and darkening up some of the areas that would really be, darker behind the engine there. So by doing all this, you get a lot of dimension added to that engine. And it makes an area that your eye can go to and kind of bounce around and look at. So just adding some more indication detail on these carbs. Now this line that I just drew straight down is I'm treating this like chrome. So you're going to get a strong core and highlights on that. And right here I'm going to draw the other side of the vehicle. And then give some indication to where the steering wheel is. A lot of times I'll even draw little guys in there and stuff that just adds scale to the car. This one here you wouldn't really see the guy because the roof would be covering him for the most part. So right now, like this area back here, I'm figuring out like where a back window would be. And again, drawing all the way through everything that I have drawn so that I kind of know where that back window would be placed. So on this I just kind of darken in the whole interior. Because it would be really dark inside there from where you're looking right there. And then if you even darken in these areas, it just, again, it's adding dimension to the car. So what I did there is that's actually the shadow that is cast down from the overhang off the roof there. So here on the grill, just filling in those vertical lines, just to give it indication that it is deep in there, and that's actually, that it is sucking in air through those things. Again, I added kind of a little bit of a hard edge line to the front of that grill, kind of matching the line that goes around the shoulder of the hot rod, around the window I should say. So this thing's almost done. I'm feeling like it's pretty good and gonna go ahead and sign it. Filling a little bit of areas here kind of in the body. Doing a real light crosshatch on there. And what that is there is kind of a ground line. It's the ground plane reflecting off the body of the car. Just add some dimension that way. Darken up a few lines in the back just to make the sketch a little more solid on the page there, and a few more indication lines and some darker lines here and there. This thing is pretty close to being done. I just want to thank you guys for hanging in there and watching the sketch. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you guys learned a little bit from it. And be looking for more of these in the future. I've been recording all my book sketches. I probably won't narrate every single one. I'll probably end up speeding up a few of them. So, again, hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.